Hi, I'm John Groders, and this is No Shame. Today, you'll meet John J Thompson, a man with a long career creating, crafting, and marketing music through his own company and through Capitol Records, and his involvement with many facets of the Nashville music community. And his challenge to all of us is to not give up short of what is truly good, truly true, and truly beautiful.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame.
Well, welcome. We have John J. Thompson on the podcast today, a writer, a producer, and the Associate Dean at the Trevecca School of Music and Worship Arts. Is that right, John?
That is correct.
Okay, so just to start
got it on
off,
the first try. That's impressive.
What is the Trevecca School of Music and Worship Arts, and do you have a football team?
No, we don't have a football team. We've got lots of other sports, not football. Trevecca Nazarene University here in Nashville. It's 100 and some year old school, and in the Wesleyan tradition. And the School of Music and Worship Arts is essentially the combination of all of the different music schools that were existing have been united under that title. So there's a worship arts program. There's a program called the National Praise and Worship Institute, which is sort of a boot camp. It's a 2-year certificate program for students that are studying being worship leaders. And then there's also the commercial music program. There's a songwriting program. There's people that are studying engineering and production. So all of your more traditional music majors, that's in the School of Music. So when you look at all of that stuff, there's even a music business program, and I have sort of, I serve them as well. That exists actually in our business school, but I even work with them. But I kind of help connect all of those different aspects of the Trevecca music programs to the Nashville music community and the music community at large, and vice versa. My whole career has been around music and in the music world, and so they brought me on to be sort of a conduit to connect this world to that world and bring artists and producers and industry people to the campus, and then find opportunities for the students to get real world experience and input and wisdom. And so that's what the associate dean, that's what I do anyway. It kind of created the position when I came here, so I love it. It's been a blast.
More matchmaking than, do you work with students directly? Are you ever teaching, or are you more setting these opportunities up for people?
I don't have my own course load, but I actually had a class yesterday. I do guest teaching, covering classes for other people, speaking about specific subjects for different classes. Sometimes I'm doing judging. I created a couple of programs. I created a thing called Music City Colloquies, where I bring in guest speakers and we do special events around that. And so that's a series that we've done. I also created a program that we call our Artist Development Incubator. So one student per semester will go through a sort of an artist development gauntlet that I lead very hands-on, and I take that student through a process that's very similar to the kind of stuff I would have done in the artist development program at Capitol when I worked at Capitol. So they're meeting with producers and record label people and publishers, and they're getting a real-world feel for what the industry is looking for and getting feedback on their songs. And for that whole semester, they're out around the creative community in Nashville getting a lot of input from people, and then they come back and they deliver what they're learning to their fellow students, and that's been a great program. So I specifically administered that program as well, and then I speak at chapel sometimes, and I do other things around the school as well, and I do kind of career counseling or advice with students one-on-one when they need it. They can get time with me especially when they're getting ready to graduate and they're heading off into the music world, and they're looking for some advice and guidance on maybe what their path might look like. And I love that kind of thing. So.
It's a big world, and I know you've got a lot in your background. But when you're working with aspiring artists, worship leaders, what are you seeing in this generation that you're excited about, and maybe what do you see that you might be concerned about?
Well, it's kind of the same thing. What I'm excited about is also what's the biggest challenge and what can be the scary part, and that's that there used to be this very rigid, very well-defined superstructure that you could use shorthand of call it the industry. There were big, powerful record companies and publishers and managers and booking agencies and all of that. And that industry created all of the opportunities. So if you wanted to have a career in music, you had to go through those gateways. And it required a certain amount of professionalism, a certain amount of expertise, a certain amount of excellence in order to get to that point. And so there was a fairly high bar, and reaching that bar, you had to be very good. You had to have a certain amount of luck, be in the right place at the right time. You had to know somebody, all of that stuff that we've all heard those stories a million times. And so there was a downside to that, because some very talented, very deserving people just maybe never did meet the right people, never did find themselves in the right place at the right time. But that bar, that standard, also meant that by the time somebody did get to that point, it took some time, and it built some maturity in them, and they learned some hard lessons, and they had some experience and some wisdom. So usually, not always, but usually, there was a level of sophistication and understanding that came with it. By the time you reached those levels, you were ready for them. Now what's happened is much of the industry has kind of collapsed. What's left of the industry is just a much smaller version of what it used to be, and it's focused on a much smaller percentage of the diversity of the music than it used to have. And now anybody can go record whatever they want, just about for free. And so that bar that used to be so high, that wall that was so hard to climb, and it was expensive, and it took years, and you had to really work hard and had to be really great, that wall is down, and anybody that wants to could go home tonight and record whatever they want to for free and release it digitally and get it on Spotify and get it on iTunes tomorrow. And that means that everybody is, and most of it is terrible. Most of it is just nonsense. And so now there's just chaos and noise, and the people who are having moments where maybe they have something that's good, they have a halfway decent song, or they have a opportunity that presents itself, they didn't necessarily have those years of character building and experience and relationship building that used to happen. So when they do get opportunities, they don't necessarily have the sophistication and maturity to know how to handle it. So there's a lot of great acts, because anybody that wants to can go make really good music for a fraction of what it used to cost. Digital recording, home studios, it's just, there's a lot of great stuff about that. But there's a dark side to it too. There's some risk. And so working with young people now, the challenge is how can we take advantage of the positive aspects of this, but also prepare people for the new challenges that are waiting in the weeds. And when we find people who have a voice, who are ready for that, how can we cut through this noise and find an audience for them? It's harder than it's ever been. Even though it's cheaper than it's ever been to get music out, it's harder than it's ever been to connect with an audience, ironically. So it's a whole new set of problems, and we need a young generation of problem solvers to figure that stuff out. And that's why I love, even though I'm also still working with artists, I still do consulting and management, I'm still writing, I'm still producing, I'm working on movies, I'm doing all that kind of stuff. I love also working with college students, because I really believe that this younger generation is going to be where these bigger problems are going to be solved.
The gatekeepers that we kind of complained about, if you're Tom Petty or Queen or anything, now the gatekeepers are gone. And
right.
Yeah, there's a pro and a con to that, isn't there? And it's, you've spent a lot of time sort of talking about, quality. Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. What is quality? And right. I don't know, how would you define it? Can you define it? And you're trying to bring that out in your students and teach them something better than what you just called, the chaos and the noise.
Yeah. Well, obviously there's certain aspects of quality that are subjective, especially when you're talking about art. There's taste, and what I find compelling is going to be informed by what I've been exposed to and my experiences and all kinds of stuff. And there's lots of variables in there. So what you find compelling and interesting and what I find compelling and interesting might have overlaps, but there's going to be if we have a long enough road trip together, there's going to be stuff you want to listen to that I'm going to find boring and vice versa, or that I'm going to find irritating and you're going to find pleasant. And, that's some of that is taste. But then there's certain things that are about excellence. Is something actually done well? Is the music composed well? Is it executed professionally? Is it recorded well? And so when you get into that level of things, there are some people that honestly don't know the difference between a good sounding song and a bad sounding song. We've got an entire generation of kids that have only ever heard music through tiny little earbuds. Yep. They've never listened on good speakers. Yep. So, some people might come to my house or sit in my office here at Trevecca and listen to a vinyl record on a record player played through good speakers on a good amplifier, and they're going to hear music in a way that they've technically never heard before. And so some of it is not subjective; it is objective. So there's a balance there. And when it comes to the subjective parts, there are people, because technology, things like Facebook, social media, and the internet, marketing people have done such a good job of siloing us. We used to be a lot more exposed to a broader range of things than we are now. And so part of what taste is when we're exposed to things, and we have to be exposed to new things a number of times before we can develop a taste for those things, whether that's food or coffee or music. You're not going to understand jazz the first time you hear jazz, or the second time you hear jazz, or the third time, or fifth time. You might understand light jazz or Steely Dan or something like that the fifth time you hear it, or the 10th time you hear it. But you're not going to understand Thelonious Monk until you've really worked at it for a while. But there's a reward waiting for you if you do that work. And if you're surrounded by people who value it, and you value those people, you're more likely to be willing to do the work so that you can share that experience with the community that you're around. And so in the past, I think people were more exposed to different things because they wanted to share those experiences across generations and across sometimes cultures, although that's a different topic. I think that there were definitely differences when it came to African American music and white music that we needed to see those lines blur more, and we are starting to now. But now with the siloing that's happening, a lot of people only hear one or two kinds of music. They're not hearing the cross-pollination. They're not hearing stuff that challenges them. And so they just say, I don't like fill in the blank, because they're just not exposed to it. And if they're not exposed to it long enough, they never develop a taste for it. They never really can appreciate it. And so as artists, as creative people, especially in popular music and Western music, the most interesting stuff comes when you blend those different influences together. That's what rock and roll, that's what contemporary pop music, it's a blend, a hodgepodge of all kinds of different things. So the more you reduce it down to just one or two things, it gets more and more boring. You end up with music that's just a beat. The melody is kind of going into the background, or you get music that's just one kind of melody and it's lacking, it's losing its depth and its resonance. And that's really, really sad. And I think it's also playing into the hands of some people that want to divide us. They want to keep people from integrating. They want, because it suits their marketing agenda. So I think it behooves us to push against that and get offline, off our devices, and get in space with each other and actually listen to music together and challenge ourselves to experience that in community and be inspired by it. Listen to the music that people older than us like and learn how to appreciate it. Just ask yourself, if you think you hate something like, say, bluegrass or polka music, whatever kind of music you think, there's no way I'm ever going to like that kind of music, then ask yourself, well, do you think that music empirically is bad if millions of people have enjoyed it for decades or 100 years? Or maybe is it just that you haven't experienced it in the right way? And if that's possible, then maybe you just need to dive into it a little deeper and surround yourself with people that know how to appreciate it, kind of like good food, good cuisine, good wine, and let people who are experts in it teach you how to appreciate that. And that's when things start to open up, and you can start to life just gets richer. Life gets more interesting. And to me, that's a better way to live. That's a better way to be in community. That's a better way to be a human being.
Well, you're listening to the No Shame podcast. Our guest is John J. Thompson. And my hope is that if you're listening to this conversation today, that you can expand a little bit, and then you will find out that it was worth it. And John, you've written a book that I've read part of now, Jesus, Bread, and Chocolate, Crafting a Handmade Faith in a Mass Market World. And here's one of your quotes, and I think it's what you're talking about. I'm losing my taste for the pre-packaged and the canned. I search for the good, the true, and the beautiful grooves of an LP, the pages of a book, the frames of a film, a small group. I want to ruin you for the cheap stuff, the manufactured versus the handmade, between plastic and flesh. Why do you want to ruin me for the cheap stuff? I can afford it.
Well, I don't know if you can.
Right.
I just don't know if you can. Frankly, I think that we've bought that lie that we can afford Twinkies or white bread wrapped in plastic because it's only 59 cents a loaf, and we can't afford the whole grain bread that costs $3 a loaf. But the fact is, can we afford diabetes for the next 40 years? The costs are hidden. And I'm using that as a metaphor. I mean, there's actually literal truth there as well. Right. But there's hidden costs in cheapness. So if you say, well, I can't afford the time it takes to have a real friendship, so I'll settle for having 400 shallow friendships on Facebook. You can't afford that, actually. Your soul, your heart can't afford that. What if the disciples said the same thing about their faith? Well, I can't afford the kind of faith that Jesus is calling me to. I'll settle for a bumper sticker, fortune cookie kind of faith, where we just have platitudes and we don't actually live this out in the context of community. I just don't think that's an option, and I think that the church and we as believers have taken on the values of commercialism and industrialism far more than we have shaped the values of those things. And so we start to define success by the values of commerce. And so we think if something is big, it's good, it's successful. If we think if something is fast and convenient, if it makes us feel good, what we're doing is we're kind of applying a definition of success to our lives across all aspects of our lives that really applies only to consumption. And that's not really primarily what we are as disciples. We're not consumers at that point. We're producers. We're craftspeople. We're designed to go and make disciples of all nations. We're not called to go consume Christian products and become fat and happy. That's not the Great Commission. So when I say I want to ruin you for the cheap stuff, it's because once you develop a taste for good bread, then you go back and you just don't want the cheap stuff anymore, and you lose your taste for the pollutants, you lose your taste for the chemicals, you lose your taste for the additives, and you find that the healthier stuff, even if it costs more, if it seems like it costs more, it actually satisfies you more, so you consume less of it. And it turns out that in some cases you can actually make that stuff yourself. You can actually make bread at home. You can cook more food at home. Some people are killing themselves eating fast food because they think they can't afford healthy food, when if they actually learned how to cook more, they could live healthier lives. Now, all of that is also, like I said, it's true on that level, but it's also representative. Each of those chapters in the book has a point to it that's pointing to something spiritual, something emotional, something that's an underlying principle. Because at the end of the day, bread is bread, and what you drink and what you eat and the music you listen to is of lesser importance than the trajectory of your heart and soul. But that's what I'm getting at is, honestly, we can't afford the cheap stuff. We've only got so many years on this planet. We've only got a certain capacity, and we just crowd ourselves out with this cheap stuff. And I think that that's one of the ways that our enemy has sidelined the church as we become distracted with consumption, and our bandwidth has been filled with that, and we're not producing what we need to produce. And our primary role, we see ourselves as consumers, and then we go to church, and if the church is not producing the right product for us, we go to another church. And we say, okay, this church has the music I want to consume, and it has the kind of teaching I want to hear because the pastor's funny and thoughtful, and that's the right kind of teaching I want to hear, and it makes me feel I got the coffee is good, and the people it's all about what I'm getting out of it. And so I'm approaching church as a consumer. We can approach everything in our life as a consumer. What am I getting out of my marriage? What am I getting out of my friendships? Or we can approach everything as, I'm here to serve, I'm here to build, I'm here to invest in the kingdom. It's not about what I get out of things, it's about what I give. And that's a total inversion. And that, to me, I think, is what the kingdom is about. That's what all those parables that Jesus gave us, they're I don't think I can think of any of them that underscore the importance or primacy of us being good consumers. They're all about us being good builders, good harvesters, good neighbors, and so I just don't think we can afford the cheap stuff. I don't think it's an option.
And so here's the irony. It actually is good for us. So even in the phrase, this made sense to me. You wrote, it's much easier to maintain a shallow connection with someone than cultivate a real relationship. It can take effort to learn how to like real food. And you actually made me think, when I go to a restaurant, I might typically just go back to what I know is going to be fine. A hamburger is always going to be fine. It takes risk to try a new food, to be in a new culture, to try something new. And I can sometimes I think I've shielded myself from some of those experiences. But when I look at my own grandchildren who will eat nothing but macaroni and cheese, I want to say to them, hey, you're missing out. Well, I'm missing out. You've actually inspired me the next time I go to a restaurant to order something I haven't tried before.
Exactly,
now, that's just in the realm of food. You expand that to the art that can enrich our lives if we gave it a chance. And now you're taking it even a step deeper, talking about our faith. Yep. And saying, if you would be willing to try some new things, invest in some new relationships, volunteer in some new ways, it's not only eat your vegetables good for you. It's really cool to learn that sushi is fantastic. Even if you didn't know that before, now you do know that.
Yeah. It's like discovering that there's a whole other layer of crayons under the 8 that you've been using. there's 100 more, and you can color your life in a whole different way. And there's joy in that. There's joy in figuring out that there's more notes on the piano that you had no access to before, or strings on the guitar. There's joy in experiencing all this beautiful stuff God has given us to experience. But there's also something else that happens, I think, when we push ourselves to experience new things. We can create community with people that we previously felt were other than us. I know in my life, food and music in particular are gateways to community. When I sit down with somebody in their home especially, and it's a different culture, it's a different community, and I eat with them, and I hear their stories, there's a level of intimacy that happens there. Now I'm starting to become more aware of their story and their experience in this world, and it becomes a lot harder for me to paint them with my story or my imagination of what their reality is. And now, all of a sudden, truth, which, you've got the old cliche of your side, my side, and, but now when I start to think about issues of justice, issues of rightness, and I'm taking somebody that I might have previously thought of as my enemy, but I'm sitting at a table with my enemy, and I'm eating with my enemy. I'm listening to the music of my enemy, and I'm starting to realize that person is not my enemy, that I can actually, something as simple and seemingly trivial as food and music can help me get over the lie that this person is my enemy. They're not my enemy. They're my brother. And we might not believe the same things about certain things propositionally, but food and music can lead us into community where we can now, some very important things can happen. And I can be moved to be more generous towards that community. I can be moved to actually do things that will bring about justice for that community. And that's even more important, I think, than just enhancing my enjoyment of life. As great as that is, when I start to realize, if you think back to the civil rights movement, for instance, the fact that it took television pushing images of what was actually happening in the African American community into white homes for things to really start to change. People were able to tell themselves it's not that bad, stuff's not really happening. But once the television was able to get those images out of one community and into another, and then music, when people started to hear these stories set to music in terms of folk music, gospel music, and then later when you have the Motown era, when music that was traditionally associated with the black community crossing over and being enjoyed by people in the white community, you start to see these divides eroding. And there's affection that can happen both ways. And change starts to happen as a result of that. I tend to feel that there's something holy about that God wants us, his children, who are all the same to him, to be united. He wants us to be one, as he and the Father, as Christ and the Father are one. And so when we come together through music, someday we will all be singing the same songs. Someday all these divisions will be put aside. But here in this side of eternity, there are opportunities for us to listen to other people's music and get a feel for what they're going through as well. And if we just are totally tuned out, we don't pay attention to anything but the macaroni and cheese music that we're already comfortable with, well, we're going to miss out, because those songs are being sung, those stories are being told, and we're just whistling right past it because it makes us uncomfortable. And I think that's not just a missed opportunity. I think we'll have some answering to do for that at some point.
So we're talking with John Thompson, not the Georgetown basketball coach, and I think not the one that wrote my first piano book. Is that correct? That's not him either?
Yeah. Hence the middle initial.
John J. Thompson.
Right.
These are kind of some deep thoughts you're throwing at us. You're challenging what it means to be a part of the body of Christ in the world. And you're kind of connecting that with the fact that we will silo ourselves now down into what we're comfortable with, the temperature we like, and everything else, and that you can see that in the art that we produce or that we consume, but somehow that is reflective maybe of the depth in which we're willing to embrace who God calls us to be. That's a lot. You're putting a lot together. Do people get this?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I think some do.
Yeah.
I think that the word says for him who has ears to hear, some folks get bothered by this. I got bothered by some of these ideas, and I'm not going to say that this is something that I just woke up to one day. I think I kind of detail it in the book. This was a 10, 15-year journey for me that started with a conversation in my kitchen with a baker about bread. And then I realized that even at that point, I was already a few years into a deep sense of dissatisfaction, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly I was dissatisfied about. And when my friend, the baker, he made this just incredible bread and sweetbreads and stuff, and I made the comment that I didn't think that stuff could be made by hand. I thought it had to be made at a factory, and he lovingly corrected me and was like, well, this is how it's been made for 1,000 years. And factories have only been making bread for 100 years or so. And he kind of corrected me and even told me a little bit about the history of white bread and how bread was whole grain for most of human history, and it really wasn't until medieval times that people started to figure out how to pull all of the brownness out of the bread. And they thought, just because they were ignorant, they didn't know any better, the more they processed the flour and pulled the brown parts out, the longer the bread would last. It wouldn't spoil as quickly. So they were starting to think they were making it healthier because it wasn't spoiling. And so, they thought, well, we're doing something good because this is more refined. And so the richer people were eating the whiter, softer bread, and it would last longer before it spoiled. Well, the the truth of the matter was the reason it wasn't spoiling is they were pulling everything of nutritional value out. So there was nothing for mold to eat. All that was left was this starchy sugar stuff that was the white part, the endosperm. So the poor people were getting all of the lower quality brown bread, which actually had all of the fiber and nutrition in it, and the white bread was going to the quote-unquote upper crust people, the wealthy people, who were actually getting the no nutrition bread. And he was telling me that story, and I just thought, well, that's amazing. And then it really wasn't until World War II and the birth of factory bread and plastic and the ability to put this white bread that had no nutrition in it in grocery stores where it could sit for weeks. And then somebody in the government tested it and realized this bread has no food value. It's like giving people sugar. And so they started to chemically inject artificial vitamins back into the bread so that they could say that it had nutrition, and they called it enriched bread. And that whole process, if you go back 100 years before that, or maybe not 100 years, this guy Graham, who we get the name Graham crackers from, who was a Christian and kind of a radical, and he had some crazy ideas, but he was protesting a lot of this stuff as well, and saying that this over-processing of flour was unhealthy, and he was on to something, but people thought he was a kook because the factory owners were saying he's anti-commerce, he's anti-business, he's anti-profits, and so they branded him as a kooky guy. Well, this whole thing was interesting to me on one level, but then it struck me that this really was very similar to the dissatisfaction I was having with kind of the American church experience. It wasn't about me just questioning whether there was a God or whether Jesus was who he said he was. It was that if the church was doing what the church was supposed to be doing, the world should feel a lot different than it feels. And something is off. Something is not functioning the way it should be functioning. And when my friend the baker was telling me about bread, it just seemed like a direct parallel. There's something wrong with this. Something has been removed from this gospel to the point where the product that's left is actually fundamentally flawed. It's maybe to the point where we can't even call it bread anymore. And then we just artificially inject stuff back into it so that we can call it food again. And that started me on this process of thinking through what other things have we done that to? And what other, how does this affect our concept of community? How does it affect our concept of integrity? How does it affect our concept of purity and discernment and all these other things? Because we as people, if we truly see ourselves primarily as consumers, which is kind of my central thesis, then we abdicate all of those important faculties to professionals. We say, we'll let the church or Christian authors like me, or Christian bookstore people, or Christian musicians and professional pastors and celebrity pastors, we'll let them do the discerning for us. And we'll just sit back and we'll consume Christian products. We'll listen to Christian radio, and we'll buy Christian books, and we'll just consume the products that somebody has sanctioned for us, instead of doing the hard work of discerning and learning and creating and crafting. And then what happens is we lose our sense of taste, we lose our sense of smell, we lose our ability to chew and make this stuff ourselves. And so as I got into this and I started talking to other practitioners in the worlds of coffee and brewing and all this other stuff, I just kept coming up with these additional examples of products that have lost the essence of what they were, and I saw direct parallels to other spiritual principles that I was at risk of losing. And so in my own community, in my own small groups or house church or fellowships, we started focusing on talking about those things, and then that became the book. Some people embrace the conversation and they think this is really interesting. I find younger people find it really compelling and interesting because they're less invested in the superstructure of what you might call the evangelical industrial complex. They're already unplugging from that. But some other people get very bothered because they are very invested in that, and so they feel threatened by it, and they're defensive, and so they think maybe we're poking at their system. But I find that the beauty of this is when you talk about something like coffee or bread or music, you can find common ground with people, and then you can ask these questions and say, well, if that's true about bread, how might it also be true about something else? Then you can back into the conversation that way, and it's less threatening to somebody than if you just started going after them about something a little bit more personal, a little bit more theological, and so that's the approach.
It seems like a caution to say, maybe this is a summation in a way. If we as the church are saying to people, Jesus said, "I am the white bread of life," then you got to ask yourself, wait a minute, what's been removed from that message? Because I think there is a tendency, especially in this consumerism that you want, if we're trying to just be an attractive brand that sells more than the next brand, and if white bread is selling, and I know we're pushing the analogy to the limits here, but Jesus did not say, "I am the white bread of life," and your analogy kind of fits. Why did Jesus say, "I'm the bread of life"? Where would you connect that with this conversation?
Yeah, I talk about that in the bread chapter, and when he says, "I'm the bread of life," and that's actually a theme that comes up in a lot of different passages. It's not just one sentence. For Jesus, it's an important concept that he brings up all the way through the Last Supper, and frankly, even beyond that. So if you go back to the Old Testament and to manna, and God providing them just enough bread for the day, and they have to trust that there's going to be enough bread that's going to come tomorrow. And you go and you kind of realize that bread sustains us, that we need that bread or we die, that bread unites us, that bread is really kind of the birth of community, that grains, cereal grains, the ability to grow these crops and harvest them and find things to do with them, whether it's baking or brewing, that's really the dawn of civilization. That's when people stop being hunter-gatherers and start settling down and planting crops. So bread is central to the human story, and God uses that picture as a snapshot or a vivid example of our total reliance on him. And then he uses that total reliance to say that is him. We are reliant on him. And he is the bread, not just that feeds us right now, but that once we taste of that bread, we won't go hungry again. And so, yeah, if he was to say, I am the bread that had everything chewy removed from it, and I'm going to go down really easy, and you're not going to choke on this ever. There's no crust on it. I'm going to have all the crusts removed. It's just this nice, fluffy, like that kind of bread. That's really very similar to a lot of the kind of version of Christianity that a lot of people want to hear. They want to hear a gospel that goes down easy, and it's super sweet and inoffensive and easy. But that's not bread. That's something else, but it's not bread. Bread is chewy. Bread is crusty. Bread satisfies you. Bread, gets stuck in your teeth. Bread is something that you rely on it every day. When it's good bread, even if it's not manna, you bake it fresh, you use it that day. The second day, maybe you can make, French onion soup or something out of it. By the third day, you're making croutons out of it or French toast. By the fourth day, you're feeding it to your chickens. Like, it doesn't have a shelf life. You need it daily. It's something that you're constantly having access to. We need constant access to Christ. We need constant access to his word, not something we just go to once a week and have somebody else think about for us and give us a nice, pithy 20-minute feel-good TED Talk kind of sermon. We need direct access to chewy, difficult bread. And then we need to know how to generate that ourselves. Not that we're not making the bread, we're finding it. We're finding the wheat, we're crushing it, and we're mixing it with the ingredients in the context of community. We're baking it. It's all about that, the village. It's about the community experience. We're sharing it with others. We're breaking bread with others. And so, when Christ's body is broken for us and we're remembering him in communion, we're doing that all the time. Whenever you do this in remembrance of me, he says. So it's this constant reminder of our dependence on him. It's not a once-in-a-while thing. We don't just occasionally stop at a rest stop and put some money in a vending machine and get a little bit out and go, yep, I'm still a Christian. It's this constant need to go back to the source. But when we abdicate that, and it becomes very convenient to just, whenever you want to, go back to the vending machine and get a little plastic-wrapped piece of Jesus, you can see why we're not as desperate, we're not as dependent on him as we need to be. We tell ourselves that we actually have everything under control, that we can get it whenever we need it because it's very, very convenient. And that's not the way it was. That's not the way it should be. That's not the way we should be treating the body of Christ, whether we're talking about the body of Christ metaphorically or the bread that we're breaking.
Psalms, taste and see the Lord is good. I'm reminded of a day we were on a scout trip in the Sinai Desert. We were shooting, and we were climbing up Jebel Katarina, the highest mountain in Egypt in the Sinai, and we were 5.5 hours into the climb. I was totally exhausted, actually. And the Bedouin all of a sudden said, we're going to stop here for a minute. And they pulled out this dough and they patted it flat. And they started this coal fire right on the ground, right in the dirt. And they burned that coal until it was white hot ash. And I wasn't sure how they're going to do this. And then they just took this big sort of double pizza size thing of dough and they threw it in there and they covered it with all the coals and they cooked it in the dirt for a while. And then, at the right moment, they pulled this thing out of the dirt. I'm watching this, thinking, is this my Wonder Bread meal? And they scraped the dirt off it with some little stick, broke it into pieces, and handed it to us. And it didn't take a culinary expert to say, this is the greatest tasting thing I've ever. I didn't know this could be true. I have never experienced this. It wasn't spiritual maturity. It was just, wow. Yeah. Who knew this could be the truth? Now, you've actually given me an idea. I think I should put a red circle carpet in the front of our church so that it could be more TED Talk-like. But the same thing in Christ. Until we have tasted maybe something that we haven't tried before, we haven't tasted it. We haven't experienced it.
Yep. I had a similar experience with some coffee in Mexico, and this guy I was helping some missionaries make some film and tell some stories about what they were doing, and they took us out to the desert. And I'm a coffee connoisseur, and I roast my own coffee and I grind it myself, but here I am in the middle of the Baja Peninsula, and this rancher takes a fistful of pre-ground coffee that's already mixed with brown sugar, and he just grabs it in his dirty hands, and when I shook his hand, it was just covered in calluses. I don't know how his hand even moved, and he just grabs a fistful of coffee and throws it in the pot with the water, and throws the whole pot into the fire and boils it all together, and then just pours the water off the top into the cups, and no measuring, no Chemex pot, no filters, none of that stuff. Wow. And I'm drinking that thing, and it was great. It was also there was a moment going on of hospitality and fellowship, a language barrier and a generational barrier, but there was a heart connection being made, and I loved that cup of coffee, and I loved that moment, and there was something else that was beyond the coffee that was going on. But yes, taste and see that the Lord is good, but sometimes we have to have our taste buds healed, because our palates have been so corrupted. Someone who's been eating super sugared things, Jolly Rancher candies and stuff like that, their palate is so tuned to hyper sugar, hyper salt, that when you go eat an apple, you can't appreciate the natural sweetness of an apple. But if that same person was to fast from artificial sugar and candy for long enough, and it doesn't take that long, a couple weeks, you can actually regain your sense of taste. And somebody who does this, we did this, my wife and I did this 30-day fast from all sugar about a year ago. And no artificial sugar, nothing but just fruits and vegetables. And it was incredible to see how the natural fruit from grapes just blows your mind when you haven't had any table sugar. And that's another example of tasting and seeing that the Lord is good. When you've corrupted your palate by what you think is good, but it's really not good. Our wanters are broken. We want the wrong things, and we get the wrong things sometimes. But when we fast from those things long enough, our sense of smell, our sense of taste, our sense of goodness can come back to us. So then when we experience what God's goodness really is, we can appreciate it in a way that we never appreciated it before. And that kind of satisfaction then can lead us to lean harder into that, to where it becomes easier to say no to the false stuff. Because now we've tasted the richness of that true thing, and we can say, I don't need that fake thing anymore. I'm good. I understand real love. I can say no to pornography. I understand, the value of this real beautiful thing. I can say no to this lie. I understand the value of a real friendship. I can say no to this online argument. There's all kinds of examples, but sometimes it's got to start with a little bit of detox, where you got to really separate yourself and fast from those things to get your palate back.
We're talking with John J. Thompson, author of a new book called Jesus, Bread, and Chocolate, and also a music producer and a consultant and a guy who has been in the middle of the art world for his whole career. And he's calling us to something better. It's ironic that it was just this week I actually pulled out my old turntable, set it up in the middle of my living room, found a box that had been sitting in my basement for literally 23 years, filled with record albums, and I just kind of calibrated my living room around. Now, these are old records. They may not be any better than new records, but for me, there was something beautiful about that. But you've actually made a connection now. If I'm going to put that record album on and enjoy something that I think had some quality to it at one time, that there's a spiritual parallel with that. And I guess, as you said, you quoted Randy Stonehill that says we shouldn't be undernourished and overfed. Let's be nourished and let's be nourishers. And your parallels with food, with music, with art, you're calling us to intentionally take a step towards the deeper, the better, the richer, the truer.
I hope so, yeah.
Well, I hope you're listening to this and that you have a chance to think, what would this mean for you today? What would this mean for me today?
Yeah. Sometimes with the vinyl, it's less convenient. Those records went obsolete for some good reasons. They're fragile, they warp, they scratch, just like people. But there's something valuable about fragility and understanding that, and the time it takes, the care that it takes. And when you make an event out of listening to music, and it's not just playing in the background while you're doing something else, there's value in all of that. There's a ritual to it, and so there's all of these things are kind of pointing us to something else.
That is beautiful and very, very well said. And plus, if you're listening to it on vinyl, it's probably not auto-tuned. So there's even that added benefit. And I'm only sad that my own music career sort of started after the days of vinyl were over for the most part. So my first album was on a cassette and then on CD and then on Napster, and it's just gone from where to where. But something beautiful about the fragility, about it not just being in the background, about the care that went into it. Listen to a vinyl record. Order something on the menu you've never ordered before. Participate in church. Don't just consume it. But do consume the book Jesus, Bread, and Chocolate by John J. Thompson, because it's good, and it'll inspire you. And John, thank you for conversing with us today and for investing in these students that are obviously coming out of Trevecca with some richness that you have poured into them. I imagine that they have a lot to offer the world.
I hope so, yeah. I hope so. It's fun. I've been doing this now for, 30 years ago. This year was when I originally launched True Tunes, and we just relaunched TrueTunes.com. I got the name back, and so if you didn't have hope for the future, it'd be hard to keep doing this stuff. But now that we've got that back going, I keep meeting young people that are just getting started in their journey, and I'm reconnecting with people that we knew at the beginning of our journey. And it's great to kind of connect all these people back together and say, look, let's keep having a conversation about the good, the true, and the beautiful, and avoid the cliches and avoid the artificial boundaries, and just have it be a little bit. Our catchphrase this year has been analog sounds for a synthetic age. Let's keep the dialogue open, and it's been a lot of fun so far. And so, yeah, I invite people to join us in the conversation.
Well, I really appreciate it, man. And I could talk to you for hours. I played it at Cornerstone back in the day. I wanted to talk about Res Band. You've got a rich, and we've got a lot in common. But I'll let you go for today. But if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to keep in touch. What you're talking about is right at the intersection of faith and culture, which is the definition of this particular podcast and what people listen for. And you've articulated so many things today. You've given us a lot to chew on, specifically.
Well, thanks. And if you're a Res Band fan, I'll also let you know I'm working on a movie called Electric Jesus right now that's about a Christian heavy metal band in 1986, and they actually cover a Res Band song in the film. I'm the music supervisor and doing a lot of other stuff, so keep your eyes open for that. It'll come out next year.
Wait, say the name of that again?
Electric Jesus. If you look up E-Jesus Film on either Facebook or Instagram, you can find some really fun behind-the-scenes clips and stuff. It's a mainstream film. It's not one of these kind of Christian movies. It's a real-world movie, but it takes place in that world, and it's been a lot of fun to work on. It's a fun story. So.
Oh, I can't wait. Outstanding. Yeah. Thank you for your time. John J. Thompson.
Absolutely.
On No Shame. Thanks for listening.
Have no shame.
No Shame is a weekly podcast where John Groders discusses life at the intersection of faith and culture with all kinds of interesting and inspiring guests. Subscribe to the podcast today by going to johngroders.com, select the podcast tab, and hit subscribe. Listen whenever you have time, but don't miss any of these life-giving conversations.